Hello, everybody. Welcome to another episode of Onion Soup. And today I'm really excited to have our guest on, Mr. Dada Neil Ananda. How are you doing?
Hi, thanks for inviting me, Dexter.
Thank you for coming on. So, I really want to dive into a lot of your work because you really just wrote the book on meditation. So, can you start with how you got ordained as a yoga monk and writing books on meditation?
Well, I wrote a book on meditation. There are a lot of books on meditation. So, yeah, I grew up in New Zealand and I had no idea that I was going to end up doing this through my most of my, my childhood and adolescence. But when I was about 19, I had a very kind of life-changing spiritual experience, a kind of epiphany, and I became very interested in yoga, started reading the books on it, and I read one of the very influential books I read was Autobiography of a Yogi
Mhm.
by Paramahansa Yogananda, a very famous book. And I read that and I thought, I want to be that guy. So I was really into it. So I was fortunate enough to meet a monk, actually from a slightly different order, but it's related to Yogananda's tradition. And I learned meditation, and before I knew it, I was in Australia, sort of doing a kind of intensive training there. I was only 20 by this point, and then by the time I was 23, I went to India and to do the sort of full training, and Nepal actually. And the training's pretty interesting. It wasn't that long, like altogether, it was really only about 8 months. But when we're there, we're meditating 6 hours a day, living very simply. We have no money. I mean, it's like I had one pair of shoes, and when somebody stole them, I had no shoes for a while, and we're eating, very basic food. But my mind was so peaceful, and we were studying a lot of sort of Sanskrit scriptures and all these, doing yoga every day. And one thing I noticed is that during that period when we were doing so much meditation every day, my concentration was incredible. And I would read these like difficult scriptures, and it was like reading a novel. It was super easy. I never had such focus. And I realized that intelligence isn't just it's not something you're just born with. It's sort of how well you use your mind. And if you're really focused, your mind is much more capable.
Mm.
It's much more powerful, essentially. So I found, yeah, it was a really great experience. The last week we live as you live as a beggar,
Oh,
and when you're allowed to sleep at our training center, but you go out and you beg for your food. And you're not allowed to speak to anybody, so they don't know what's going on. Here's this white guy in Kathmandu, in the sort of hills around Kathmandu, wandering from door to door, begging, saying some Sanskrit phrase, and we're not allowed to explain ourselves, or if we do, we're not allowed to accept anything from that person. So
mm.
it was really cool, but it was a great feeling. I remember the first day of this one week, I went out and I was walking along the road, just had this two cloths and a begging bowl, bare feet, and the Himalayas were in the distance,
Mm.
and it felt great. I felt incredibly free.
Mm. Wow, that's beautiful, honestly. I haven't really heard of what the full journey, what the full process is like. So when you first got started, how hard was it for you to really just leave your life behind and go into this really simple life?
That's a perceptive question. It was hard. Yeah, New Zealand's a nice place to grow up. I had friends, I had my university, I had my family, and all these things I wanted to do. I wanted to become a professional musician, but I just felt called. I felt like I love this, but I want this more. It wasn't just wanting. It was like I felt this was my kind of destiny. I felt like I had no choice. I couldn't live with myself if I didn't take this opportunity, and it was super hard.
Mm.
But as the years passed, it became better. And looking back, best decision of my life.
Wow. So when you're going through this journey, this process, 'cause I really want to dive into it. When you're getting started, I understand it's challenging when you first get started. And you said that you had a sense of peace when you were reading the scriptures. How long did it take you to get from within that 8-month time period to get from, okay, I'm here and I am happy that I'm doing it, but to really feeling the energies around you and to really start to embody the scriptures that you're reading?
Well, it wasn't an 8-month process. This was part of, by this point, it was like year 4.
Oh,
And so there isn't any point where you say you've arrived. I mean, it's an ongoing journey. It's not, people. I remember one of my best friends and he got into meditation as well, and we were chatting, and we'd been reading all books on Zen and Buddhism and yoga philosophy, and I remember I asked him. I said, "This enlightenment thing, how long do you think it's going to take?" And he says, "Oh, I reckon about 5 years." I said, "Really? I thought it would take at least 10." Okay. I mean, looking back, I really can't help but laugh because I have no idea I mean, I know the theory better than most, but I don't know what enlightenment is. It's something else down the road. Who knows? Well, it's an ongoing thing. But there are ups and downs as there are in life. So there are moments
mm,
of insight, inspiration, beautiful spiritual experiences. That's what keeps you going. It's
mm,
like climbing a mountain. The time when you're making the most progress is when it's hard and you're going up a steep slope and your legs are aching and you're sweating, and that's no fun.
mm,
But you're doing it because when you get to the next peak, you look around, you see the view, and it's awesome. Okay, and that's the moment when you're not making any progress.
mm.
So even when people say to me, I teach a lot of people, of course, oh, I had a really good meditation, or my meditation was really hard, whatever, wasn't good. I said, it's not like that. Don't be so quick to measure or to think that you can measure what's really going on when you're sitting there in your meditation, because the outcomes, there's something changing inside you, and it takes time and it grows. And when you look back, you can see, wow, I've come a long way. But when you were in the middle of it, you couldn't appreciate it.
So you mentioned Zen Buddhism, and you're ordained as a in Hindu yoga, I would assume, right?
No,
So,
yoga and Hinduism are two different things.
oh, okay. Let's dive into that because it seems as if, well, we know that there are different spiritual practices, right? So when we're looking at different spiritual practices, what are the similarities between them, and where do they kind of differ? Where do they align with each other?
Okay, this is a giant question. I'm
Yeah.
trying to do this quickly. There are literally thousands of different sects and schools of meditation, and also, but there is a big commonality. And I would say amongst the mystical, what I would say we call the mystical traditions, and there are mystical traditions within every major religion, and they look sort of different from the outside, but there's a lot of commonality when you go into the sort of the deeper part of it. And it's around meditation practice, meditating on the unchanging self or oneness, God. It's got hundreds of names. There's something unchanging within us that is meaningful, that feels true. And if you get a little taste of that, you feel like, oh, this helps me to understand what I'm here for, what gives you a sense of meaning. And I think it's a source of our consciousness. It's a source of knowing that we exist and we're doing stuff and things are happening. It's a source of the feeling of love. It's a source of the feeling of connection. So connecting to that is what all of what I'd say the more authentic traditions are really about. And they have that in common. And there are different ways to do that. But ultimately, we're all human beings and we all have a similar physical structure, and we all have the ability to experience this with some kind of inward looking, focused spiritual practice.
Mm. When I look at spirituality and my own journey, I really do my best to get closer to that truth, that knowledge, that source, that oneness. And I feel like that's really the whole purpose, I guess, the whole point of it. Would you agree? And when you say that it's an ongoing process, is that what you're talking about? Getting closer to God, getting closer to the
Yeah.
source?
Yeah. I mean, I don't use the word God very much because it means different things to different people, and it can mean the opposite. So it becomes a difficult word because, you have to define it when you use it. So then it kind of loses kind of not really the point. Well, but that's what I'm talking about. If you know, for sure, I'm a theist. I mean, but you know, my idea of God is actually, I think it's pretty well defined in some Christian scripture. It talks about God is love. I think that's really good. Then also talks about God being omniscient and omnipresent,
Mhm,
present and omnipotent, omniscient, and omnipresent. Means all knowing. Omnipresent means everywhere, within and without everything. So pervading and surrounding reality, and all powerful, controlling, runs the universe. And so that entity. So, but it's more than energy. Some people sort of want to they feel safer depersonalizing God in a sense. But
mm,
to me, that makes no sense, because if there is some force or power behind reality that we can begin to connect to, it created us, and we have consciousness. So surely that entity has not just consciousness, something, a beyond level of consciousness, way beyond us. So to reduce it to something we can imagine as some kind of energy seems to me, it doesn't make any sense to me.
yeah, I get that. I feel like a lot of times we do break God down to either something really small and we give it too many human characteristics, or
Very human behavior, yes.
or we make it so grand that we can't even rationalize, this omnipotent being, which, I mean, we can't because we're humans. But
Well, yeah, I think, by definition, God is indefinable. That's a paradox for you. And all of the great teachers, and Buddha and Krishna and these people, they they have this problem. They can't communicate what it is that they have understood and realized and who they've become, because they're limited by words. These are very inadequate. I mean, you can't even, how do you communicate a color without reference to something external to yourself that other people are also presumably seeing, but you don't really know if what they're experiencing is the same as you are. Now, what to speak of something that's so subtle that it's beyond the mind and created the universe, we can't describe it.
mm.
So we resort to poetry and songs and practices that enable us to experience it directly.
So when we talk about the teachings of Buddha, Krishna, and the other enlightened individuals, and this is ultimately when we do meditation and we go deeper, what practices have you found that tend to be the most helpful for yourself and some of your students to go deeper into meditation to get closer to this truth?
I would say two big things, well, three. I'll try and keep it to three because there are many. One is spiritual chanting or singing, because it really engages emotion. We call it kirtan. It's chanting mantras. So we chant the mantra or sing it first and then go into the meditation. It makes it much easier because it puts you in the mood. Somebody gets back from work, they're a programmer or a marketer or whatever, that's where I live, and then they want to sit down and meditate. They got all this stuff, anxiety and just thoughts going on from work and their lives. It's unreasonable almost to expect them to sit down and then let all that die down and focus inward. It's very difficult. The quickest legal way, I should say, to change your state of mind is music.
Mm,
It's incredibly powerful. So we use that a lot. And I grew up playing music. I'm a musician, so I use this a lot in my teaching as well. But yeah, one of the keys is to use the right music, right kind of music, to put people in the mood for meditation. It makes it far easier. That's number one. Secondly, in meditation, meditation is a kind of concentrated thinking. So you're focusing on one thing, one idea, rather than allowing your mind to wander around the place like it usually does. But the big question is, what are you going to focus on? Now, if it's true, as is said in psychology and neuroscience, but long before that, in the teachings of Shiva and others, what we focus on, we tend to become like that. And that's actually been demonstrated in brain science through neuroplasticity and neural pathways and that sort of thing. But this has been known for a long time. So we need to, if we're going to become like what we think about, we need to better think of something good. It's not random. Some people say, oh, you just repeat a mantra and it doesn't matter what it means. This makes zero sense. It's not true. What you think about, the idea you adopt, influences you. So if you think of an idea of infinite love, or it's something really profound and beautiful and limitless, you'll gradually begin to feel that and reflect those qualities in your mind, in your character, in your behavior. However, if you just focus on, I mean, a lot of people think that meditation has something to do with gaining power of some kind. I think this is the opposite of what we want to do. Jimi Hendrix famously said, of all people, when the power of love overcomes the love of power, then we will find peace.
Mm.
He was paraphrasing something from someone less boring who didn't play the guitar as well. But this idea, I think, is really, it resonates. It's very widely quoted because there's so much truth in it. So I think this is really important to remember when you're trying to understand what is actual spiritual practice and what is the path to the dark side. Because all these metaphors and myths and modern myths like Star Wars and Lord of the Rings, so forth, they're also tapping into some kind of profound understanding. They're based on spiritual stories, actually. The Lord of the Rings was inspired to a great degree by Tolkien's Catholic belief. Star Wars was inspired very much by the teachings of Joseph Campbell, the great mythologist, who talks about the hero's journey, and they're basically saying all these myths are about the spiritual journey. They're about the journey to enlightenment. And on that journey, there are temptations, and one of them is power. And as you cultivate your own control of your mind, you cultivate your ability to focus and concentrate, you're able to influence people. You're able to understand things that you couldn't otherwise. And that's a kind of power, and it can be easily abused. It's extremely corrupting. So we have to be very wary of it. So if you focus on love, the idea of infinite love in your meditation, protects you from that. It means you're pointing yourself in the right direction. You're not going to get caught up in these lesser things, really. But the third piece is, don't allow this to become a self-centered practice. That would spoil the whole point, is to become all loving and kind and good. It means you've got to do something. So service is a huge part of what I think enables people to improve their character, get to know not just the world, but get to know themselves better, because it's difficult finding ways to really help people and to help the world. But that difficulty is a challenge that helps you to improve yourself and grow. So I think it's really important to balance your meditation practice with some sort of really meaningful service to the world.
Mm. When we look at control and power and taking gratitude and glorification is the word I was looking for, glorification in one's acts and doing service to others, does it ever occur or happen where people do things to help others purely out of self-fulfillment and they're not necessarily doing it for the other person? Is that counterintuitive to the process?
No, it happens. People, I go to a university and there's some big, beautiful building and it's got somebody's name on it. This was done by some alumni who made $1 billion. If they were really doing service, they wouldn't want to put their name on it. It's ego. Of course, it happens all the time. So, there are degrees of purity of selflessness. You could argue that it's, if you feel that by helping others, I will become a happier, better person, which is true. That's also self-centered in a way, but I think it's pretty healthy.
That's fair. That's more of what I was diving at because I've definitely had people approach me and say, "Well, I love helping people, but that seems as if I'm just pleasing and glorifying myself in such a way." I'm like, "Well, there's nothing wrong with taking pleasure in your own work. You should be happy with what you're putting out. but also don't let that control you and don't let your ego take over, as you were
Yeah,
saying.
exactly. Don't hold back just because you're afraid you might make a mistake. I mean, that's also that itself is a mistake. Krishna said in the Gita that we are bound to action.
Mm,
And imagining that you can avoid sin or error or whatever by not acting is itself an error.
I love that. So when you mentioned the Gita, the Bhagavad Gita, and the Mahabharata, where, from a historical standpoint, do those events take place? Because to me, they seem to take place 4, 5, 6,000 years ago.
Not a bad guess. Well, there is not agreement on this, I should say. I have an opinion on this from based on what I've learned. According to my understanding, the Mahabharata and the events of that great battle and conflict and the Krishna's role in it was around about 3,500 years ago. And there's quite a bit of, and you can say, evidence of that the city of Dwaraka, for example, existed, and there's evidence of the battle and the conflict and so forth.
Mm,
So definitely something happened around that time. But there's quite a bit of debate amongst historians about exactly when.
mm. When you're looking at the great battle that occurred during that time period, it talks about these fantastical weapons and things that occurred.
Oh, yeah,
How
the Bhakti Astra, yeah. So some people think that's real. This is a long time ago. It was, we have enough trouble with the Bible. That was only 2,000 years ago. 3,500 years ago, there was, I mean, okay, technically the first writing started then, but it hadn't spread. Nobody wrote anything down, not a single word of the teachings of Krishna. So this is all recorded by somebody who supposedly viewed the events through some sort of mystical vision, you know. So, I'd say it's a rough approximation of what happened. And as far as, you know, psychic weapons and so forth, maybe some people think they're referring to atomic weapons. I think that is not feasible. I'm sort of somewhere between a skeptic, but at the same time, I believe some weird stuff. You know, but I've seen so many fanciful stories and exaggerations around spiritual events, spiritual abilities. Yeah, I think we have to measure to get some sort of rationality.
So when you say you believe in some interesting things and being a skeptic and having read the autobiography of a yogi myself, what is your perspective on the different cities and the spiritual abilities of certain yogis?
So somebody once asked my guru this, so I can give you a nice answer straight from the guru's mouth.